19th century Orkney produced so many remarkable scholars that it was said that its main exports were fat cattle and professors. And one of the most distinguished of those professors was Matthew Forster Heddle, who became Scotland's greatest mineralogist. He also became one of Scotland's leading mountaineers. It's through his great-great-grandson, Hamish Johnston, that we're able to know more about him, through a biography published by the National Museums of Scotland in 2015. Hamish, like his ancestor, has a connection with St Andrews University, as indeed we'll hear. He studied there French and German and went on to a career in health service administration, working in Oxford, Edinburgh, and Inverness, where he retired in 2006. And again, like his famous ancestor, he has a deep love of hill walking and climbing the Munros. Hamish is with us now to tell the story of a man from Hoy whose life spanned mineralogy, medicine, and the Munros, with chemistry as well. Hamish, welcome, and I'm looking forward to hearing the story.
Thank you very much, Howie, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to talk to you about my great-great-grandfather, Matthew Forster Heddle, the son of Orkney. He was first a doctor, then for almost 30 years, professor of chemistry in the University of St Andrews. His main claim to fame is as Scotland's greatest mineralogist, the author of the encyclopedic The Mineralogy of Scotland. Published in 1901, it is still regarded as the classic work on its subject. Heddle also has an important place, if largely unrecognised, in the history of Scottish mountaineering. We start our story in late 18th century Orkney, where the Heddle estate was at Cletts on South Ronaldsay, and the Moody's owned Melsetter on Hoy and Walls. This is Melsetter, and the area of Hoy and Walls where Heddle was born and spent his childhood, exploring the terrain, cliffs and shores on foot and by boat, and collecting shells and plants. But Melsetter was the Moody estate, so how did this come about? During the Napoleonic Wars, Robert Heddle, his father, joined the army as a paymaster and was sent to the small strategic island of Gorée in West Africa. After British forces drove the French out of Senegal, Robert was put in charge of army supplies and payment to African princes of the gifts or bribes needed to oil the wheels of commerce. When Robert saw the money made by traders, including Matthew Forster, of whom more later, he resigned and became a merchant himself. He left for home in 1817 with a fortune equivalent to £5 million today, and he bought the Melsetter estate from the trustees of the bankrupt James Moody. Moody had a 25-year-old daughter called Henrietta, whom the 38-year-old Robert met on his return to Orkney in 1818. He courted her, and they married at Melsetter 3 months later. Heddle was born on 28th April 1828, the youngest of 8 children to reach adulthood. He was named after Robert's friend and business associate Matthew Forster, but was always known as Forster rather than Matthew. Heddle's mother Henrietta died in 1833, when Heddle was only 5, and his father died in 1842, when he was 14. From 1842 until their majority, Heddle and 3 other orphan siblings were supervised by a panel of curators that included Matthew Forster. He was now MP for Berwick and defending his reputation against accusations that his trading company was engaged in illegal slave trading. As for schooling, Heddle was sent by his father to Edinburgh Academy in 1837, but in 1842 the curators moved him to Merchiston Castle Academy. The curators assumed that Heddle would become a farmer, but in 1844 he said he wanted to be a doctor. His next step was to be Edinburgh University. In October 1844, Heddle matriculated at Edinburgh University. He was placed for bed and board at 51 Albany Street with Dr. John Brown, who also supervised his studies. Brown worked at Minto House Hospital, which had been set up by the surgeon James Syme as a rival to the infirmary. Medicine was taught in the university and the extra-academical schools, which were authorized by a separate body, the College of Surgeons. These schools were in Surgeon Square, and also in Brown and Argyll Squares, which are now both under Chambers Street and the National Museum of Scotland. Heddle was taught by or under some of the greatest names of Scottish medicine, most notably the obstetrician and anaesthetics pioneer James Young Simpson. Let's return to Heddle's collecting activities during the years of his schooling and medical training. Heddle had a collecting habit from a young age, starting with shells and plants, but from 1843 it was minerals. In 1846, aged just 18, he gave a mineral collection to the Kirkwall Museum. In the summer of 1850, Heddle went to Germany to study mineralogy at Clausthal in the Harz Mountains and Freiberg near Dresden in Saxony. These were major centers of mining and mineralogy teaching, and both possessed a mineral dealership. In 1850, Heddle recorded 560 mineral specimens in his collection, including pieces acquired in Germany. On his return, he joined the Edinburgh Geological Society, more of which in a moment. He graduated MD in 1851 with a thesis called The Ores of the Metals, written with a view to examining their medical applications. We now move on to the years from 1851 to 1857. After qualifying in 1851, Heddle worked for several years as a doctor in the Grassmarket area of Edinburgh, one of the city's most deprived districts. His home was in St. Vincent Street, then Clarence Street, both on the Stockbridge side of the new town. Why Heddle chose medicine, we don't know, because he was really a scientist, and disliking medical practice, he spent as much time as possible engaged in mineralogical activities, as we will see over the next 3 slides. It was around 1850 that the student Heddle met wealthy businessman and mineralogist Patrick Dudgeon, who had just returned from the Far East. They became lifelong friends, Heddle later naming one of his daughters, my great-grandmother, after Dudgeon's wife. Dudgeon's many expeditions with Heddle were big affairs that used yachts for transport and accommodation. Heddle's best documented expedition was a 2-month visit to the Faroe Islands in 1856, from which he returned with more than 12 barrels full of minerals, mainly zeolites. Another friend was Alexander Rose, a mineral dealer and teacher who was a founder member of the Edinburgh Geological Society and host to the Society's meetings in his classroom in Drummond Street. It was there that Heddle first met Archibald Geekie, who was to become director of the British Geological Survey and Heddle's friend and confidant. 1858 saw the publication of Gregg and Lettsam's Manual of Mineralogy of Great Britain and Ireland, a pioneering book not superseded for 150 years. Robert Gregg knew Heddle at university and asked him to edit the book and contribute by checking the chemical content and providing most of the Scottish material. We now turn to the Edinburgh Geological Society, the EGS. Founded in 1834, it was rather moribund by the time Heddle joined in 1850. He was quickly noticed for his expertise and his willingness to teach other society members. So Alexander Rose proposed him for president, and he was elected in December 1851. He was only 23 and straight out of university. The bar chart shows Heddle's time with the EGS. The grey column shows the number of meetings held each year, the blue column, Heddle's attendance, and the plum column, Heddle's talks. You will note the drop-off in Heddle's attendance after he stepped down to vice president. The reason is that Heddle understood the importance of publishing scientific papers. He was keen to share the results of his explorations and mineral analyses, but the EGS did not publish transactions. Almost immediately after joining the EGS, Heddle looked elsewhere and simultaneously became a Fellow of the Royal Physical Society of Edinburgh. Note that this is not the same as the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Between December 1854 and April 1856, Heddle read and published 8 papers with the RPSE, and in 1856 he was elected a council member. Then, between 1855 and 1859, 13 Heddle papers were published in the Philosophical Magazine, then the country's most prestigious scientific journal, edited by the writer and scientist David Brewster. Brewster was also principal of the United College at St Andrews University, something that was to become important. The image on this slide of a Philosophical Magazine index shows the illustrious company that Heddle was now keeping. His paper sits between those of Boole and Bunsen. From all this, it's easy to see that the Edinburgh Geological Society, and indeed medicine, were not top of Heddle's priority list. Heddle's future would now be tied to the University of St Andrews. It had 163 students and 13 professors. It was by far the smallest of the 4 Scottish universities. The professor of chemistry was Arthur Connell, who in 1847 was the first to do chemical analysis of a scarce mineral, later named Connellite in his honour. Connell had fallen ill, so Heddle, who shared the same expertise, was the ideal deputy. It probably also helped that Heddle's work was known to Principal Brewster. Heddle took up Connell's duties in the autumn of 1856, after his return from the Faroes. The post was insecure, however, so Heddle retained his Edinburgh interests for a while. By 1858, Heddle's future at St Andrews seemed more assured, so he bought a house in Playfair Terrace and married his neighbour, Mary McKechnie. The family soon moved to Westport House in South Street, where most of their 10 children were born, and finally in 1874 to St Leonard's House, where Heddle is now recorded with a blue plaque. In 1862, Connell finally resigned, and Heddle was appointed professor in his own right. At last he had a post he really wanted, but there was a downside. Because the chemistry chair was funded by a private endowment, it was paid much less than the other chairs. Another problem was other professors, especially William Swan, feared that the chemistry's inclusion in the MA degree curriculum deterred student applications, so he engineered chemistry's exclusion between 1862 and 1873, and again from 1878. Unhappy with this situation, in 1868, Heddle applied for vacant chairs in Edinburgh and Glasgow, but by then his specialty had been overtaken by other developments in the science of chemistry, so he remained at St Andrews. As a result of all this, Heddle was to suffer financial problems throughout his career. Heddle's reputation, however, attracted students even when chemistry was not compulsory. He enlivened his lectures with explosive practical demonstrations likened to conjuring tricks, and accounts of, and I quote from a student, miraculous escapes from death, which he more than once had when, suspended by ropes, he was collecting minerals from the face of some beetling precipice. Heddle had firm principles and was unafraid of sticking to them, even if this caused awkward relations with colleagues and the university. 2 examples must suffice. In 1862, when Heddle first became professor, all students were male, but he admitted to his class a woman called Elizabeth Garrett. This was swiftly countermanded but Heddle taught her privately for a few months. She went on to become famous as Britain's first woman doctor, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Second, in a University Council debate in 1862, he had a dig at professorial colleagues when he said that he taught chemistry so that his students might understand its application, and that when they went from his class, his students would be workers, not dreamers. Unlike some other professors, Heddle was sympathetic to the student body and supported the recently revived annual Kate Kennedy pageant, which still runs today. The event included the publication and sale of a cartoon and annual that sent up the professors, and they did a procession round the professors' houses where students cheered or groaned according to their opinions of the professor. The event met with the disapproval of Principal Forbes and that of Principal John Sharp, who succeeded Forbes in 1868. In 1879, Sharp insisted on the prosecution of some students, alleging rowdy behavior outside his house. Heddle appeared in court as a witness, but for the defense. The charge was not proven, leaving Sharp with egg on his face. Out with university affairs, Heddle's profession caused him to be used as an expert witness in court cases. For example, in 1863, he appeared for the prosecution of Dundee factory owners over their alleged breach of smoke pollution laws. The owners learned fast. The next year, one got his case postponed by retaining Heddle as his advisor. Heddle was a member of the R&A Golf Club, but was not a distinguished golfer. Heddle is noteworthy for sharing knowledge out with his classwork. On arriving at St Andrews in 1856, he joined the town's Literary and Philosophical Society, and after his death, the society noted that he had contributed more papers than any other member. He often undertook extramural teaching, which generally involved programs of public lectures in local towns and supporting the activities of local learned societies. From the outset, Heddle was keen to support women's education. In 1878, he was the first St Andrews professor to deliver lectures for the new Ladies' Educational Association. From 1876, the university provided a qualification called the LLA, Ladies Literate in Arts, and in 1892, it finally admitted 19 women from an intake of 67 as full students. Here we see Heddle above the red dot as the central figure in this photograph that includes the first batch of St Andrews women graduates. We now revert to Heddle's mineralogy in the period from 1858 to 1875. We must note that despite publishing many scientific papers in the 1850s, Heddle produced only one short piece in the 15 years from 1860 to 1875. An explosion of published work occurred in 1876 and after, so it is clear that in the preceding 15 years, Heddle was concentrating on fieldwork, mineral analysis, and writing. We can mention 3 specific examples of fieldwork. In 1861, Heddle led a dig at Dura Den near Cooper to extract fossil fish for the Literary and Philosophical Society's museum, of which he would later be the curator. One fossil fish was later named after him, Gauroptychius heddlei. Second, in 1875, James Joss, the Minister of Golspie and creator of the Duke of Sutherland's museum in Dunrobin Castle, brought to Heddle's notice the famed Ben Vrec boulder near Tongue in Sutherland, from which he was to extract 17 separate minerals. Joss also helped Heddle investigate the Kildunnan goldfields. And thirdly, I must mention Portsoy in Aberdeenshire, which was another favoured Heddle locality at this time. We now reach 1876, perhaps the most significant year in Heddle's life. We'll follow 3 simultaneous strands in the years to his retirement in 1884, years which saw extraordinary contrasts in his fortunes. First, St Andrews University, which had been declining for some years. In 1876, it reached its lowest point, having only 130 students. In contrast, Edinburgh, the largest, had 2,351. 1876 also saw the government set up a royal commission to look into the funding, curriculum and facilities at the 4 Scottish universities. Given the pressures on him, it's not surprising that Heddle's evidence to the commission was outspoken. He told them that the university was, I quote, a sinking ship, and that it was, I quote, Dundee or death. Dundee, then a burgeoning industrial city with a huge pent-up demand for tertiary education, offered both threats and opportunities for St Andrews. Heddle thought survival for St Andrews depended on creating a science faculty in Dundee, and said he was willing to move there. When the Royal Commission reported in 1878, it recommended little help for St Andrews, however. Indeed, the government asked if the university should survive at all. Meanwhile, talks about how to meet demand from Dundee had meandered indecisively for several years, then fell away with the collapse of the New Tay Bridge in 1879. However, everything changed the next year in 1880, when a huge donation from a Dr. Baxter led to the immediate creation of a university college in Dundee, without any regard to the interests of St Andrews. The first professors were appointed in 1883, including a professor of chemistry, Thomas Carnelli. Meanwhile, 1876 also saw a renewed internal threat to Heddle. The art students, supported by some professors, who Heddle called classical duffers, petitioned for chemistry to be removed from the MA curriculum once again. Heddle fought for 2 years, but in 1878, the university finally yielded to the students' demands. Things for Heddle as regards his chair were indeed grim in these years. He looked for other employment and asked Geekie to get him a job with the Geological Survey. He even contemplated selling his mineral collection to raise money to support his family. Back now to 1876 and the second but very contrasting strand. What helped keep Heddle sane was his 6 months of mineralogy every summer. A delightful image of him emerges from Professor in Excelsis, a 12-verse poem written by Geekie, which reveals how Heddle tolerated his university post and lived for mineralogy. Its first stanza reads, "Hurrah, the winter session's done. My last exam is over. My load is gone. I skip as free as ever, mare in clover. No Senate meeting haunts me now, with hours of dull debating. Committees, council, one and all, I leave them and their prating." Other lines include, "Go, wife, dear partner of my lot, rouse from their winter slumber my wallet, hobnails, flask and stick, and all my travelling lumber. Myself, I'll pack my hammers up," such gear my wife denounces, "from puffing Billy, that weighs 2 stones, to trim Tom of 8 ounces, and so on and so on. Letters and references in Heddle's book and papers show him popping up all over Scotland during these years. For 4 years from 1879, Heddle supplemented his existing routines by joining the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Boulder Committee. It was set up in 1871 to catalogue erratic boulders, discover where they came from, and to suggest how they got there. The Boulder Committee chairman wrote the annual reports and said, I quote, "These extracts give no idea of the enormous amount of labour which the professor has undergone in his boulder researches. During the summer and autumn of 1880, he must have walked several hundred miles over districts, many of which are not accessible to ordinary pedestrians." It's important to mention Heddle's role in the great controversy over the geological interpretation of northwest Scotland that ran for around 20 years from about 1865. It involved a dispute between, on the one hand, the establishment geologist Sir Roderick Murchison and his successor as director of the Geological Survey, Archibald Geikie, and on the other hand, a succession of independent geologists who challenged Murchison's opinion that the observed geology could be simply explained in terms of a stratigraphic sequence. First of these was Professor James Nicol of Aberdeen, who worked with Murchison and found evidence of faulting that Murchison ignored. He was followed by others, including Hicks, Bonney, Callaway, and Lapworth, all of whom published increasingly convincing evidence based on their fieldwork. Eventually, Geikie was obliged to send Ben Peach and John Horne, his two best geologists, to look again. They told him that Murchison's interpretation was now untenable, so Geikie quickly published their findings in the journal Nature in November 1884, but without giving credit to the independents. It turned out that there had been a massive overriding of older over younger rocks in a line from Durness to Skye, what we now know as the Moyne Thrust. Heddle had been very active in Sutherland throughout this period. Between 1881 and 1884, when the controversy was at its height and still unresolved, Heddle published 6 long papers on Sutherland, adding up to some 320 pages, as well as his own geological map of the county. Heddle knew and worked with all the participants, with the exception of Murchison, and shared a close friendship with both Nicol and Geikie, who were on opposite sides of the debate. Despite his misgivings, Heddle came out in support of Geikie in 1882. Nicol now being dead, perhaps this was because of loyalty and his need of Geikie's help in tackling his troubles at St Andrews. The cartoon on the slide from a Heddle letter to Geikie neatly illustrates the complicated situation. Now we return to 1876 and look at the remaining strands of Heddle's life up to his retirement. This is his mineralogical life, which is now approaching its zenith. In 1859, Darwin's On the Origin of Species had diverted geological thinking towards fossils. To counter this, Heddle and other colleagues, including Nicol, Dudgeon, and Geikie, founded the Mineralogical Society of Great Britain and Ireland in February 1876. Heddle was elected co-vice president and later served as president between 1879 and 1881. The Society established the Mineralogical Magazine, which immediately became the principal vehicle for Heddle's papers, these appearing in almost every issue. In 1878, it published the first of 13 long Heddle papers, totaling 541 pages, under the general title of The County Geognosy and Mineralogy of Scotland. These examined the geology and mineralogy of Shetland, Orkney, Caithness, and Sutherland. The next important point is Heddle's recognition by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. In 1876, it published the first of 8 Heddle papers in a series called Chapters on the Mineralogy of Scotland, and totaling 380 pages. In these, he organized Scottish minerals into related families. So impressive were the first 2 chapters that the Royal Society of Edinburgh instantly elected Heddle a Fellow, and in 1879 it awarded him its prestigious Keith Medal. Some other recipients had been James Clerk Maxwell, Brewster, and William Thompson, that's Lord Kelvin. All this success was in the greatest possible contrast with Heddle's unhappy situation at St Andrews. We now move on to the final 13 years of Heddle's life. In anticipation of his retirement, the university granted Heddle leave to take up a job with a gold mining company in South Africa. This slide shows part of an 1883 newspaper advertisement inviting investment in the Lisbon-Berlin Transvaal Goldfields Limited, whose chairman was Baron Albert Grant, now known to have been a notorious conman. In late 1883, Grant appointed Heddle as the company's mineralogist, geologist, and assayer. His name and qualifications are prominent in the advert to encourage investor trust. Heddle secured a large salary to be paid 6 monthly, shares, and importantly, an annuity bought for him up front. The confident Lisbon-Berlin Company spent huge sums acquiring the land, mining rights, Californian machinery, and electric light installations to permit 24-hour working. Heddle arrived on site in February 1884, but on examining the locality, he told the company that it did not match their fulsome claims. When the company failed to pay his June salary, Heddle left immediately, whereupon the company sued him for breach of contract and return of payments made, including the annuity. It also engaged in a public campaign to smear and belittle Heddle's reputation and abilities. Heddle, however, threatened a counteraction in the form of a petition to wind up the company on the grounds of its insolvency. When, in November 1884, the matter reached the High Court in London, the company agreed to Heddle keeping all his money and the annuity in exchange for Heddle withholding his petition. This did them little good, though, because Heddle was right, and in 1885 the company went bust, although it was later restructured. In November 1884, St Andrews University agreed to let Heddle retire on health grounds. He may have retired from his chair, but his scientific life was to be as busy as ever. By 1890, he was taking steps to secure the future of his great mineral collection in a major museum. The British Museum Natural History fell out of the frame because, contrary to Heddle's stipulations, it wanted to cherry-pick specimens. Then St Andrews was eliminated when it failed to raise funds for an essential museum extension. Finally, the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Art, that's today's National Museum of Scotland, secured the Heddle collection, part by sale, part by gift. In the meantime, in 1892, the Edinburgh Museum had engaged Heddle to work there part-time, integrating the mineral collection donated by Dudgeon with the one it already held. Then the acquisition of the Heddle collection meant integrating it with the museum's own collection. When the work was completed in 1895, the Scotsman wrote that it was, I quote, the finest national collection of the minerals of any one country in the world. Meanwhile, in St Andrews, the declining Literary and Philosophical Society was enjoying a revival under the leadership of Alexander Toms, a businessman who, on his return from Bengal, had become a pupil and friend of Heddle. Heddle was an active member, often chairing meetings and contributing talks. Despite earlier problems, Heddle now participated happily in university affairs in his capacity as an emeritus professor, attending council meetings and serving on committees. He was also a respected citizen, sought out by journalists, scientists, and politicians. Let's look at Heddle's mineralogical activity during these last years. In 1883-4, Heddle's allegiance to the Mineralogical Society changed after it declined to publish his latest geognosy paper on Rothschild. Heddle then discontinued the series. Heddle must have gained great satisfaction from the favorable reception given in 1883 to his 87-page article on mineralogy for the new 9th edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica. Heddle's exploration of Scotland took a new and exciting turn in 1879 after a chance meeting with John Harvey Brown on a steamer trip to St Kilda. Harvey Brown, a man of substantial independent means, was a natural historian, ornithologist, and author who invited Heddle to join him on his private cruises in the Western and Northern Isles. These took place in 1881 and then every year from 1884 to 1891, at first on chartered vessels, then from 1887 on the Chiantel, which Harvey Brown had specially built. Heddle's final cruise was to the Faroes in 1894. On this occasion, he suffered a recurrence of severe lumbago, no doubt the result of years of manhandling heavy rocks, as a result of which the cruise was curtailed. The maps here give an idea of the extensive routes they followed. The background is from a 1-inch Ordnance Survey map marked by Heddle to show the route of the Chiantel, plus his walking routes, in this case on Barra Head and Mingulay. The main purpose of the cruises was to gather material for Harvey Brown's books, which had titles such as The Vertebrate Fauna of the Outer Hebrides. Heddle provided the book's geological content and also carried out research for his own purposes. Harvey Brown's journals are a mine of information about their scientific work. For example, at the marble quarry at the south end of Iona, they, I quote, hammered away with little Billy, Heddle's 28-pounder and chisels and all, to get at a vein of steatite. The journals also describe their social activities, to which Heddle contributed enthusiastically. He had a great talent for storytelling and was often master of ceremonies in the evenings on board. We now look at the personal aspects of Heddle's final years and the publication of his masterpiece, which was now all but complete. The last 10 years of Heddle's life saw the death of his wife in 1891, the marriage of 4 of his children, and the emigration to America of his youngest son, Stuart, in 1892. By now, Heddle was suffering badly from heart disease, first felt in 1877, and was cared for by his eldest daughter, Clementina, who was latterly helped by a nurse. Heddle made and revised his will, and a final family gathering was held in April 1897. Heddle died 7 months later, on the 19th of November. He received a formal university funeral and was buried at St. Andrew's Cathedral in the corner beyond St. Rule's Tower. Clementina was now free of caring for her father, and in April 1898 married the widowed Alexander Toms. Heddle's will charged Toms, his daughters, and others with forming a committee to edit and arrange the publication of the Mineralogy of Scotland. This was achieved when, thanks mainly to Toms and J.G. Goodchild of the Geological Survey and Edinburgh Museum, the 2-volume work was published in 1901. If Heddle's reputation as an academic chemist is not distinguished, his position as Scotland's greatest scientific mineralogist is unequalled. The scale of his achievements was enormous. Of all the mineral species from Scotland known in 1901, Heddle contributed 1/3, and he was responsible for 1/4 of all the British species. Heddle's enduring reputation in modern times was demonstrated when in 1987, Livingstone and others named a newly discovered mineral, mathedolite. Today, 123 years after its appearance, and notwithstanding the discovery of new mineral species, Heddle's masterpiece, The Mineralogy of Scotland, remains the classic work on its subject, and Heddle continues to inspire serious mineralogists. Now to conclude this talk with a complete change of tack. Heddle as a mountaineer, something for which he should be much better known. I've given entire talks on this, but today must restrict myself to Sir Hugh Munro, Heddle, and Scotland's 3,000 feet mountains. In September 1891, Hugh Munro published his tables giving all the Scottish mountains exceeding 3,000 feet in height. By then, Munro had climbed only 100, but he got his information from Ordnance Survey and other maps, plus information provided by other Scottish Mountaineering Club members, including Heddle. Munro's original tables recorded 538 summits over 3,000 feet, of which he regarded 283 as separate mountains and 255 as subsidiary tops. As many of you will know, the first person credited with climbing all Munro's separate mountains is the Reverend A.E. Robertson in 1901, but Heddle nearly beat him to it. These two important manuscript extracts were written before Munro's tables were published and reveal Heddle's opinion that there are 409 mountains in Scotland exceeding 3,000 feet in height. Heddle and Munro already knew each other, and Heddle gave Munro aneroid measurements for 15 unsurveyed peaks for his tables, so it is very likely that he passed his list of 409 peaks to Munro. Unfortunately, Heddle's list has not survived, so we can't climb Heddle's. But what about his own ascents? He told Geekie and the St. Andrews Literary and Philosophical Society that he had climbed 350 of the 409. I was later able to establish a total of 357. At the time, Heddle was way ahead of the competition. His friend Reverend Peyton was on 270, Colin Phillip was on 260, and the others, including the as yet unknown Reverend A.E. Robertson, were, I quote, nowhere. By combining written sources with information from Heddle's marked quarter-inch maps, I was able to identify 346 of Heddle's ascents, a close match to Heddle's 357. Originally, I thought Heddle must have had only a few to do to complete Munro's separate mountains, but my analysis of his 346 ascents reveals 187 separate mountains or Munros and 159 tops. Given Heddle's state of health, I don't think he could have done the remaining separate mountains even if the tables had been published earlier, say in 1889. However, is this really significant? Does it lessen Heddle's achievements in any way? I don't think so. First, the distinction between separate mountains and tops didn't exist before Munro's tables. Second, although Heddle loved hill walking for its own sake and had a notion to climb all the 3,000ers, his decisions over the years were determined by geological and mineralogical priorities. It is obvious that Heddle would easily have completed the 3,000ers on his list some years before, if bagging them all had been his principal aim. To put things into perspective, the Reverend A.E. Robertson climbed his first Munro, Ben Cruachan, only in 1889. By the time Heddle gave up in 1892 with 357 ascents, Robertson, who was guided by the tables, had climbed barely 10. So let Sir Hugh Munro have the last and the authoritative word. In 1898, he was president of the Scottish Mountaineering Club and wrote after Heddle's death, I quote, "There can be little doubt that Professor Heddle had climbed far more Scottish mountains than any man who has yet lived. No district was unknown to him, and scarcely any high mountain unclimbed by him. And wherever he went, there went not merely the trained geologist, but the truest lover and keenest observer of nature, and above all, of the Scottish mountains." Despite all this, Heddle is unjustifiably absent from the mountaineering literature. Ken Crockett's Mountaineering in Scotland, the Early Years, contains only a brief unrelated reference, and Heddle is entirely absent from Ian Mitchell's Scotland's Mountains Before the Mountaineers. Inexplicably, he is absent from the SMC's latest guide to the Munros. But this is unfortunate, but perhaps with a forthcoming revision, if and when it happens, Heddle will be restored to his proper place. On the other hand, in his The Munros, also published in 2021, Andrew Dempster relishes his discovery of Heddle and devotes much of his historical chapter to him. So maybe Heddle's true place in the story of Scotland's mountaineering is gradually coming out of the shadows. I hope so.